This is Jeff Nosanov, and thanks for joining the Space Madness podcast, where we talk about all kinds of different things in the space industry, whether it's science fiction or Artemis program or what have you. So today we have an interesting person with us, Matt Bille, and he has had a very interesting career touching lots of different aspects of the space industry. And I'd like to get his story out there and share him with the world. So Matt, if you could introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me on this, Jeff. My encounters with space began at a very early age. I'm an Apollo kid. I had the fortune to grow up an hour south of Cape Canaveral in Vero Beach. I watched Apollo 11 with my own eyes. I know I'm dating myself, but as my wife would say, it's not like anyone else would date you. My dad worked for Piper Aircraft, and he rented a little Piper, and he flew me and my brothers up. And we observed Apollo 11 from a unique
From the air.
point.
Wow.
And I can still see this brilliant red, yellow, orange pinpoint, growing on the pad, and then see the rocket going out to sea. The rules were easier back then. You could get within 10 miles in a private.
That was my next question. Wow. There can't be more than a few thousand people tops who saw that from the air. That's amazing.
So I thought I was going to be an aerospace engineer, and I learned I was allergic to calculus, but I went into the Air Force. I spent the first part of my career commanding a Titan II ICBM site. Those of you who remember the old liquid fuel rockets, which were later repurposed as launch vehicles and which had been launch vehicles in the Gemini program. So I had a hands-on piece of space launch, and that actually fed something I'll get back to later.
Sure. And you didn't need calculus for that, it sounds like.
Algebra would do.
Okay.
Anyway, I had two other Air Force assignments. I wasn't going to get to the kind of things I really wanted to do. So I went to private consulting with analytic services, and then Booz Allen Hamilton, and spent 23 years there and did some very interesting NASA work. And all the same time, I was doing my own writing. My first paper on space was about 1992. I've been able to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. Didn't get to be an astronaut, didn't get to be a fighter pilot, but a lot of things in this space age that I grew up with.
Wow. Well, I love that story of, usually I ask people where their love of space started, but I can't imagine a better point of view than, how old were you in that airplane?
I was 9.
9. Okay. So the perfect age to instantly imprint on something like space exploration for good. Wow. So I'm trying to imagine the lead up to that. I mean, what's the first thing you remember before that launch?
Well, before that launch, fortunately, my dad, who worked avionics and related things, he was a space buff. He told me, and I can't remember it, but he told me that when I was a baby, he took me outside our house in Maine to watch the old Echo 1 balloon satellite go over. I wish I remembered it, but Dad was always a space buff. It was a wonderful, there's nothing else I could have been, really. So that was great. We moved to Florida in 66, and I remember a couple of smaller launches and then him taking us up for Apollo 11. I remember going to the beach south of the Cape to watch Apollo 17 launch at night. I can still pretty much see that one, too. So it's been quite a ride. And I was lucky to be present for 2 real firsts in the space age. The first was Apollo 11. The second was in college when a bunch of us at USC drove up and camped out on a freezing lake bed to watch the first space shuttle land from orbit, to watch Columbia land.
Wow. Now this is USC Southern California or South Carolina?
Yes, Southern California.
Southern California. Now that I live in Atlanta, I have to make that distinction. So I have to imagine could you feel the Saturn V through the seat of that little aircraft you were in?
No.
I mean, it's one thing to see it.
Not that close.
Not that close. Wow. Okay. What an incredible start. So you grew up, that was your imprinting moment. And what did you study in college then?
I started in aerospace engineering and could not handle it. I got a 2 on a calculus test once. But I finished in public administration, went into the Air Force.
Okay.
Did 3 tours related. Tours is not quite the right word when you're an officer, but I had 3 assignments.
Okay.
Titan ICBM crew, which was the most challenging and the most fun. I did some code loading for Minuteman ICBM guidance, and I spent
Okay.
a little time as a command post controller for a tanker wing, and then I moved to the private sector.
Okay. So I'm interested in those 3 assignments actually. So
Sure.
you said that you did code loading. Did I hear that right? Is that
Yeah.
tell me about that.
Well, after the Titan ICBM system was shutting down, they moved some of us to garden spots like Grand Forks, North Dakota, and we worked in a vault, basically loading data tapes and
Okay.
other media
Uh-huh.
into Minuteman ICBMs for targeting and troubleshooting and all of the other things that they did.
So those things you used had tape drives to store guidance software, I imagine.
We had platters the size of a large pizza back then. And they loaded into ring core memory drives, which weighed about 80 pounds.
Wow.
The size of a suitcase. They had the memory was all in a 3-dimensional mesh of wires. This was the 80s. It was a 3-dimensional mesh of wires, and every place 3 wires crossed, there was a ring, and it could be flipped in different directions based on the current. You don't
And that
see
was
those
inside
anymore.
inside the flight system itself.
Now,
That's
the flight
amazing.
system was relatively solid state.
Okay.
No advanced stuff. But the memory capacity in the missile computer was 2K.
Wow. Of solid state memory, not wire forest.
Right.
Okay. Well, so I know you as a writer, I'm curious how when your passion for science fiction writing started. I mean, I can guess, but I imagine through all these different experiences as a child, as an operator, tell me about that. When did you first realize that not only were you interested in this, you wanted to kind of tell your own stories within it? Because I can relate.
Oh, I started writing very early on. When I was 16, I sold a parody of E.T. to a little TV magazine for $15. I think I still have the check. So that's when that started. It didn't really pick up until after college. I had a side jaunt in college that was interesting. I spent a couple of weeks garbed as a World War II soldier in the Steven Spielberg film 1941.
Really?
And a couple of episodes of The Waltons, so I got to look at how TV and films were made.
Okay.
I haven't written yet for TV or movies. I've tried. I've written things and they haven't taken off.
Sure.
But I always wrote short stories. I wrote novels that were never published, some of which were awful. I wrote, and in 1995, one of my side interests is zoology and cryptozoology, sort of the odd corners of the animal world.
Okay.
And I spent a lot of time looking up things in physical libraries, early 1990s. If you wanted to know obscure things that had been published in science magazines and so forth, you crawled around in the stacks of a depository library.
Okay.
Mine was at UND and then at Purdue. And I had enough of this stuff assembled finally that I wrote a little book called Rumors of Existence, and it didn't pick up any sales, but it was my first actual publisher work, and it was very good for the limitations. Just looking at some of the odd corners, like I like to say, things that are maybe extinct or have been reported. And I've written 2 more books on zoology and cryptozoology, and I've got more of those in the back of my head.
Okay.
And then I always wanted to do novels too, and finally in 2014. My first novel, which is a horror novel called The Dolmen, came out. And just say that the premise of The Dolmen is if you're going to ship an entire megalithic tomb illegally from England to a museum in Los Angeles, sift through the dirt and make sure you're not importing anything else.
Oh, I like it. Okay.
Now, in between there, NASA put out a call for what they called the Centennial Series, series of a dozen short books for popular audiences around the centennial of the Wright brothers. And I and my colleague then, Eric O'Shaugh, put in a proposal that became the first space race. Spent 6 years of spare time writing the account of the first satellites of the 1950s. And that came out in 2004. A couple of mistakes, but it's a very good book. And I'm still proud of that work.
Now, before we go on, do you have called a bibliography, a list somewhere of all of the books you've written? Because it's quite a diverse set of subjects.
Yeah,
We'll make sure to post
on
that.
my website at mattbilleauthor.com.
Okay,
And of
great.
course, I'm happy to chat with anybody about any of it. I
Sure.
get a chance to write quite a few different things, which is
Yeah,
very
I find
interesting.
that very interesting. That's one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you because it's a diverse set of subjects. So, okay, so we're talked about your duty assignments, and well, actually, I like to go back. I mean, when you finished high school, I'm curious why you chose the Air Force and service at that time.
I always chose the Air Force because at the time I thought I could be a pilot. Turns
Okay.
out I couldn't under the rules of the
Yeah.
time, but it was
Okay.
always going to be Air Force.
I see. Okay. Okay. So, okay. So after your third, you left the Air Force and you
Yeah.
entered the private world. What was that transition like? This was in the 80s,
This is
right?
1984.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a little weird. One of the
Mm,
hard things is that I'm very bad at remembering faces, and I had a
mm,
hard time when people stopped wearing name tags at work. But I went to a small 500-person not-for-profit firm called Analytic Services,
mm,
sorry, ANSER, and I spent 7 years there, and it was very
mm,
good time. We worked on some Minuteman modernization studies and uh,
mm.
some early missile defense work, and I picked up my interest in microsatellites, which at the time were very much a fringe subject in the
Sure.
military.
You know, before we go on, you talked about, well, I'm curious, have you ever heard of the Defense Support Program?
Yes.
Okay, so my maternal grandfather worked on that at Aerospace Corp from the late 60s to the late 80s. And it's just a brief, funny story. He never talked about it, but he had a poster. He had like a poster board poster in the house. And I would later discover after several attempts to apply to the Aerospace Corporation that he worked on the ground station for that satellite defense network. The only thing he ever mentioned was that he once had to go to Greenland for it. And they told him if you don't get in that building in 60 seconds, your eyeballs will freeze. And that really stands out to me because he never mentioned anything else about his involvement, which was fairly extensive in the Cold War kind of space monitoring base. So I just love to share that story.
Fascinating. I'm sure it's not true, but it's
Yeah,
pretty
and
cool.
he wasn't the type of grandfather to tell stories like that. So I'll never know. I'll never know, unfortunately. So, okay, so you were at Answer, and now that you mentioned the acronym, I vaguely recall seeing it in Washington, D.C., or maybe seeing it in various contracts that I've seen with NASA and its service organizations. Is that in Rockville, Maryland by any chance, or am I imagining things?
It's in Virginia, I
Virginia, okay,
believe.
okay,
It was only like 500 people then. I haven't kept up with it a
sure.
lot, but we were support to the space acquisition
Mm,
business back then, and it was good.
okay,
We lost some of our space business and closed the Colorado Springs office in 2001, and I had friends over at Booz Allen Hamilton, and we talked, and we found a very good match over
okay,
there. And I continued doing a lot of the same things, comparative studies for NASA,
mm,
um, budget, helping budget planning. I was in Headquarters Air Force Space Command for several
interesting,
interesting
okay.
years, supporting missile requirements.
Okay, well that makes sense. It's
A lot of
coming
stuff.
to yeah. Well, my this may be jumping forward, but I'm
Sure.
curious if you had any insight into the formation of the Space Force, one of the more curious developments in recent years to
That
me.
was interesting. I came into the private sector after I tried and failed to get into the original Space Force, or not Space Force, Space Command. There was a Space
Mm,
Command, U.S. Space Command formed in the 1980s. You had to actually apply to get into it, and it was
mm,
decommissioned and
mm,
vanished for some years. And it wasn't until I don't have any particular insight into the formation of the Space Force.
mm,
Originally, I was opposed to it because I thought, working in Air Force Space Command headquarters, I thought space was underfunded. Space was a bill payer, I thought, for air production overruns and other things that were cooler. But I thought the overhead
mm.
for a separate force might take out of whatever resources were available and might not be worth it.
Sure.
I worked a little with Space Force in its early years, and I changed my mind on that because they were able to get a high profile, and they were able to get more funding for some of the most critical things. And they were able to get some really innovative programs, especially the smaller satellite programs, off the ground that the Air Force would not have looked at, because they had one paradigm that worked for them.
Sure.
The large geosatellites, and they weren't very experimental. And the Space Force has proved to be very experimental.
Interesting. That's really good to know. Let's zoom in on your early interest in the microsatellites and the CubeSats. So I'm curious, at what point did you see that emerging as the next big thing or little thing? Just connect that for me, if you will, with your very earliest space interests. You saw the Saturn V, and now we're talking about loaves of bread size things.
I'm not sure where I actually made that connection, but when I was writing about the early satellites were microsatellites because we didn't have a choice. Explorer weighed 14 kilograms because that's all you could put on a modified Jupiter Redstone. They called it Jupiter C. It was a modified Redstone with upper stages. And I thought that I always thought the Air Force, while they built extremely capable satellite systems, was overlooking something. And I guess it's just a personal interest at first. I wrote my first paper about it in the early 90s. And when I was at Answer, a wonderful boss I worked for, the late John Herron, who was an Air Force colonel, looked at proposals of mine to get the Air Force to investigate microsatellites. And he gave me a great motto for life. He said, well, if you own a horse and a lance, every now and then you ought to go find a windmill. Didn't make a lot of progress, but I and colleagues did some fundamental analysis of microsats for military uses that later at least had a little impact, feeding into things like the operationally responsive space and the other early efforts. And I've been at it ever since. I've probably got 20 or so of my publications relate to microsatellites and often to military applications.
Okay. Well, it's interesting to me because at about the 5-year period I spent at JPL was the first time there was real effort. I shouldn't say the first time that I'm aware of using them in deep space, sent to Mars, what have you. And of course, the two Marco CubeSats were so successful out there. Certainly, and that was around the time of the of the Ingenuity helicopter. So there was a lot of capability emerging from these very small systems that, as I would imagine you agree with, it kind of challenges the assumption and the baseline that to do anything big, you have to be big.
Yeah, and that philosophy, if you're building stuff to survive a nuclear war, that makes perfect sense. You have got to have redundancy. You can do redundancy within a large spacecraft, or you can do it with a multiple spacecraft constellation. But I think beginning about 1996 was the first time I attended the conference on small satellites. Have you ever been to that?
No, I haven't. Sounds like
it's in Utah every year, 30-some years now. At the time, this was where everybody around the world who was interested in this topic gathered. And the first time I went, there were 300 people. It's 3,000 now, and they had to move it from Utah State University to Salt Lake City because it's become mainstream, especially with SDA and Space Force.
Yes.
But there was a while there where SmallSats was its own little community. Without a lot of respect, and you knew everybody. I met Elon Musk very early in those days. I met all the people who were involved in the many failed efforts at early small launchers. It was a really fun thing to go to.
I'm curious what year you met Elon Musk, because I met him
that would have been
2009.
That would have been about 2005.
Okay, so that was
early
before
on. They were doing the first tests of the Falcon 1.
Yeah, so that was before it was successful, to put it lightly.
I actually, they just lost the second or third one and were in the dumps a bit. And I told Gwen Shotwell, who I knew in those days, that you shouldn't be discouraged because it took von Braun 35 flights to perfect the Redstone. And Musk said the Falcon 1 is basically an updated Redstone. He and I had a little chat on
Interesting.
the history of boosters, which he was very, very up on.
Yeah.
That's it wasn't at all clear that they were going to win, that the current of, space history was going to go that direction.
Yeah. Well, so that was 04, 05. That was before Constellation. That was the end of the shuttle, really. And there was there wasn't really any clear vision of what the next.
No, I and a very smart collaborator named Chris Winkler, she's Chris Davis now, we published a paper there in 06 about the Constellation program and about how microsatellites could microspacecraft could serve it the way scouts and outriders served voyages of exploration. And some of that was actually, has actually happened. There have been some small sat missions that are going to scout locations, on Mars and so forth. Just the way people forget it, but we did a history a few years ago, the Explorer program, and before Apollo, nobody knew what the Earth, Moon, space environment was really like. And there's this forgotten series of spacecraft within the Explorer program that went into that region and mapped the energies and the temperatures and the conditions and so forth. So microsatellites that nobody remembers paved the way for Apollo that way.
Interesting. One of my favorite stories in paving the way for Apollo is the JPL involvement in reaching and landing on the moon with the robotic system for the first time. And the details are a little fuzzy, but I vaguely recall it's something like this, that it took 7 or 8 tries and they failed one step closer every time, including the last failure being the thing landed but the camera didn't turn on. So they did it again. And something I'll never forget is that I heard from a graybeard at JPL that, every time it failed, we'd just call up headquarters and they'd give us more money.
Those were the days.
I never saw those days, but what a joyful, maybe it's not the word, but in comparison, what a exploratory and open-ended that feeling that must have been to be given those technical tasks, and as long as you're presumably making some progress, you get to try again. So I love all those stories. There's a hint of that in the museum at JPL, but it really doesn't tell the whole story. So okay, so you're at Booz and you're starting to, well, you tell me. It's the 90s. The microsatellite world is slowly changing.
Yeah.
When did you see a sort of sea change that it was going to happen?
Well, make sure I've got I'm not sure I've got all my dates right in my head, but for a while in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, the Air Force had the Operationally Responsive Space Program, which they really didn't want. Congress kind of nudged them until they did it, and they did build a few pioneering small satellites for observation and other tasks. The ORS did not survive, but they did fascinating technology experiments like the XSS-10 and 11 maneuverable inspector satellites that would pay off many years down the road.
Interesting.
So, it wasn't until well into the 20s that you get the military, and I've only been speaking of the U.S., but the attitude was similar in most countries, that you don't have, that you started seriously getting a look at microsats, because the argument always was that you cannot put much on a satellite the size of a bread loaf. And for many, many years, that was very true. But starting in the 90s and then accelerating in the new century, you could put more and more. The idea that you could do 3-meter imagery, even 1-meter imagery from satellites the size of washing machines and then the size of bread loaves.
Yeah.
The way Planet Labs, it was Planet Labs in those days, did. That's what really got people, was, hey, this technology matters now. We can do militarily useful things with this stuff.
So how did your thinking about science fiction and your writing change during these decades of progress and advancement?
Well, I was always a science fiction fan. I wasn't a big science fiction writer for a long time. My first novel was horror, and the second was fantasy. I did a story last year in a book called Tales of the U.S. Space Force from Baen Books, where my name appears on the same list with Arthur C. Clarke. And other people, which was rather astonishing. My first hard science fiction story published a couple of years ago it was called The Kessler Gambit. You're familiar with the Kessler syndrome idea that
Yes.
you can get so much junk in an orbit that it's unusable. And so
Yeah.
I wrote a story about the 2035 Space Force crew seeing one apparently start and realizing that a country with a half dozen satellites decided that if they had 6 satellites and the U.S. had 2,000 in that orbit, it actually worked for them to create an artificial Kessler syndrome and try to hide that it was artificially generated.
Okay.
And I'm sure that somebody has, worked that scenario, but I thought it was original at the time.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah, I've been watching with great interest the various proposed attempts to bring down some junk, whether nets or lasers or what have you. And it's an interesting economic problem. It's a pretty textbook tragedy of the commons kind of situation. And I don't know if there's anything launching soon to actually attempt this stuff, but it certainly seems like an out of control problem where one act can undo 1,000 acts of preservation and cleanup. So it'll be very interesting to see how that happens moving forward.
There are a number of missions testing various technologies for that, but that has an interesting overlap with the stuff I and colleagues published this past year on space archaeology and retrieving old satellites, because if you decide that you want to go up and retrieve something like Vanguard 1, which is still in orbit from 1958, then that is essentially a tech demo for retrieving other things.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because space archaeology is a great term. I mean, during these recordings, I often occasionally think about the title for the episode. And obviously, I have to stand out in a very crowded field, so I try to think of creative and engaging titles, and space archaeology might be in there. And it connects to something I've thought about many times over the years, which is, there's so much mass in space that we've sent up there, mostly metal. I wonder sometimes if the efficiency curves will ever cross, making it more effective to grab something that's already up there, like some spent rocket bodies, put them together into some configuration and do something with it.
It may be for particular missions. I don't think it'll be on a scale, simply because, the material you're talking about, there's tons and tons of it. But given the space that it's scattered in the different orbits, I don't think we're going to do that on a big scale.
So there's one more. So here's something to add to the archaeology to-do list. So this is one of the more obscure things I've ever read, and I'm a big fan of obscure space details. There is a single piece of the Cassini mission that is still in orbit around Saturn and will be for the foreseeable future. Any guesses what it is?
I assume, and I've got to plead some ignorance here because I don't remember Cassini very well.
Okay.
Did it have an orbiter that stayed?
It was an orbiter and a lander on Titan, and had a bunch of instruments. It was one of the big school bus sized ones, flagship missions. Basically, the thing that is still in orbit is the cap of an instrument port, maybe the size of this air tag, that was opened upon orbit insertion, that for one reason or another did not get captured. So I just love that. Of all that, I find it very beautiful and deeply philosophical that we send these complex machines to the outer planets and then basically have their gravity crush them back into an unrecognizable mass of Earth metals and materials. Particularly Galileo, Jupiter will forever be a bit of metal in Jupiter's otherwise, I think it's metal core. I think that's amazing. And billions of years, when Jupiter is destroyed by the expanding sun or otherwise separates, that metal from the Earth will be in there somewhere. I think that's kind of amazing. Anyway,
you talked about the Surveyor program landing on the moon.
Yes.
And that was the first real space archaeology, when Apollo 12 landed near Surveyor, and took pieces off the spacecraft.
Interesting. There must be a book about that. If not, you should write it. And I'd love to help you, because that's pretty interesting. Space archaeology in the 20th century. That title would catch people.
Well, we published 2 papers and held a session at the AIAA SciTech meeting in January 2025. Space archaeologist named Rachel Tillman and I and some colleagues who worked at Booz Allen with me published 2 papers. One was on Vanguard 1 specifically, which is recoverable, although fragile. And the other was on the broader questions of space archaeology. And it's fascinating work. You could go anywhere from, you've got a lot of important things in Earth orbit, things on the moon, things on bodies.
Yeah.
The upper stage of Apollo 10 lunar module, Snoopy, is in solar orbit. It'll be a long time before we have the kind of propulsion to go and get that, but we could.
Wow. What do you, speaking of the broader questions, what do you think of the idea of the Apollo sites being some kind of protected heritage sites, going forward?
Oh, they have to be.
Yeah.
Because we're going to see, even if it's not at the kind of pace that we space buffs wanted, we are going to see more and more travel to the moon. We'll eventually see tourist travel to the moon. And those sites absolutely have to be off, or whatever you want to call it, and be in touch. Those are our society's sacred places.
Yeah, I agree. And I should have mentioned this with the space law guest I had a month ago, but trying to structure an agreement like that in the emerging world where the U.S. is not the leader in civil space exploration, that's an interesting call. I'm curious, what do you think about where things stand, Artemis and moon landings again, Monday, September 2025?
Okay. We're strictly in the realm of personal opinion here.
Yes.
Because I haven't worked on Artemis. I know brilliant people have. I think the technology is going to be made workable. I'm not sure when we are going to put boots on the moon. It's going to be a few years yet, and I wish we had done it differently. If I was, the god of space and could structure it any way I want, I probably would not have used DSLS. I probably would have. But the trade-off is the smaller booster rocket means you have to do more rendezvous and docking and so forth in space, and everything is trade-offs.
Yeah,
everything in
and
space
orbital
is
refueling, which I'm watching very carefully.
I wouldn't have gone the SLS route. I would have accepted the cost of more connectivity and so forth in space, and let Falcon Heavy and Blue Origin and so forth be the launchers. But you have to start from where you are. So obviously I wish them every possible success.
Yeah. I often wonder what it was like, or what it is like, to have been born in the early 60s and to have seen those peaks, to me, those peaks of human achievement, as far as I'm concerned, in real time, and then watch the changes since. Because I was born in 82, and I vaguely remember Challenger. I definitely remember the Pathfinder landing. That was one of those things that put me on this path. Seeing that in a newspaper, which sounds hilarious to think of, the complexity of a rover landing on Mars delivered via newspaper, 1,000-year-old, technology. Yeah, I certainly hope to see these things happen. I think it's going to be very hard to predict, particularly if, as I cannot read Mandarin, so we shall see. We shall see what happens. So tell me a bit about how your booze career ended, and how we've gotten to where you are now and what you're doing now.
Okay, sure. I was with, came aboard from Answer, worked with Booz on missiles, ICBM force support to Air Force Space Command, which for a while had the ICBM force in a reorganization I never understood, one of General McPeak's initiatives in the Air Force. I've worked on a early propulsion investment study for NASA in the early 2000s, where we said, put your money on fission, and we're finally getting around to that. I worked on a lot of things related to, we were able to get some funding from Air Force Space Command for some preliminary studies and things on the use of microsatellites. There has always been a little undercurrent, of interest, microspace nerds there. I was lead author on the tactical launch study of 97, I think, which was kind of the first end-to-end look at how you would do this with units. And I updated that in a publication a couple of years ago called Guardian Scout.
Okay.
I'm digressing a little bit here, but way back in the early 60s, the Air Force had a forgotten program called Blue Scout. where instead of contractor launches, blue suiters, active duty people, learned about launch by actually operating a launch unit. And it was short-lived and the success rate was iffy, but it stuck in my head, and it's still stuck in my head. And I and a few colleagues published Guardian Scout 2 years ago, where we suggested that while we are going to be contracting out launchers, launch as a service is pretty much locked in as the way we're going for most things. We ought to have a program where Air Force people or Space Force people do hands-on launch of small vehicles so that they know in a way nobody else can know what they're buying, how it all works. It was I was the first space paper ever to manage to work in quotations from Ensign Chekhov and Peter the Great. There's a line in Star Trek where Chekhov says, Peter the Great once had a problem like that. Well, Peter the Great once had a problem where he needed to create a navy from scratch in a country with no navy. And he sent cadets to shipyards in Europe, and they learned to build ships from the keel up.
Wow.
That they would eventually command when those ships went into Russian service.
Sure.
And I always like that. So we have the idea is that you would have a couple of the small launch vehicles in active duty Space Force units, and the people who are going to eventually buy and command space operations.
So really learn by doing in the ultimate sense, starting from
put their hands
the
on
ground.
That didn't get, it did get discussed around Space Force some. It didn't get picked up, but I've been ahead of the curve before. It'll catch up.
Yeah. Well, one of the themes I like to see in our discussion is that you did all of this and you contributed in all kinds of different ways while being allergic to calculus, as you said. And likewise, advanced math is not my native tongue either. And I don't know if this is your story as well, but through sheer stubbornness and curiosity, I kind of found ways to try to contribute anyway. One of the themes that I really like to see is the ability to contribute to the space exploration effort from a variety of perspectives, and with and without different sets of skills. One of my interests is really understanding human abstract thinking and where these limits or boundaries come from in the mind that some people seem to have and some people just don't and are capable of thinking at these absurdly abstract levels. And anyway, it's a subject of interest to me, and I think we're kindred spirits in that we've found ways to contribute despite that challenge.
Yes, we did. And, I worked for Booz Allen for a long time, and some of my stuff was unrelated. I worked on EMP and other things that were not space-related. To answer your other question, I had a great time at Booz Allen. We were very supported in doing our outside private publications. Our papers are not canonical Booz Allen work.
I see.
But the company supports people to go out to conferences and publish their own work. And I really appreciated that. And I left eventually because the direction of the company is more artificial intelligence and cyber and so forth. And the contracts, how government work is. It doesn't matter how good the company is.
Right.
And Booz Allen was great to work for, but the directions didn't line up for more work for me. So I stepped out in May of this year. I am still looking to perhaps contribute for a couple more years if I can find another company that's interested in applying that kind of thing. I apply some unusual things. One of my things is the lessons of history for space programs. People sometimes forget the work that's been done before them. I've met brilliant people who didn't know a great deal about, say, X-50, the old space plane studies or so forth.
That reminds me. Have you ever heard of the book Dark Eagles?
No, I don't think so.
I'm 99% sure that's the title. You got to read it. I think you'd really like it. So you're still writing on the side and trying to find ways to finish out your career, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of things. I'm doing I have some history articles and things. I've owed Quest magazine an article on Blue Scout for I think 3 years now. I sold a scientific thriller novel, Michael Crichton-style novel, to Blackstone Publishing last year. And so we've started that'll come out in 27, so we've started the back and forth process of editing and so forth. That was my first novel sale to a major publisher, which was really, really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I have my first book coming out with a publisher early in the spring about how to do business with NASA. So it's equal parts.
That should be very useful.
I hope so. It's equal parts history of NASA contracting and how to actually get involved now. So I will be sure in the show notes to list all whatever books you want to put out there. I need to go back and look at your bibliography again because it's so diverse. I want to close on this theme of being part of history. I mean, everyone alive today is part of this space age that just it's just an absolute random chance and treat to be alive to see it. And I've never met anyone who saw it from a plane. So I once saw a photo of a shuttle launch taken from a passenger jet. And just the photo was stunning because this tiny little shuttle in the sky, and the launch exhaust trail. But I would love it. I think it'd be interesting if you've done this, sat down and wrote every possible detail in your mind from that flight.
I should do that.
That would be a really compelling read, and I think would be part of history because so few people saw that. So on that note, I think we're going to close the episode. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining me. I still hope to find ways to work together. I've enjoyed this conversation, as our other ones, very much. So thank you, everyone, for tuning into the Space Madness podcast, and we'll see you in the next one.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff.